Good morning, everyone. Uh, Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here, both those of you in person and those who are participating virtually. I'm Christopher Ray DeRocher, Vice President of Policy and Program with the American Constitution Society. On behalf of ACS, I'm very excited to be at Berkeley Law and co-hosting this important conversation. A few housekeeping notes. If you're looking for the restrooms when you exit this room, take a left, take your first right, and the restrooms will be down that hall on your left. Also, there will be opportunity for audience Q&A, but because this is being recorded and we also have a virtual audience, if you have a question, please wait for me to bring the microphone to you so that everyone participating can hear your question. ACS, through our progressive network of over 250 student and lawyer chapters across the nation, focuses its mission on supporting and advocating for laws and legal systems that strengthen our democratic legitimacy, uphold the rule of law, and redress the founding failures of our Constitution and the enduring inequities of our laws in pursuit of realized equality. Centering economic justice and law in the political economy as part of that mission is crucial. And that's why we're proud to be part of this conversation. I want to extend special thanks to Larry Kramer and to the Hewlett Foundation for its funding of the series of conferences that ACS, along with Joey Fishkin, Willie Forbath, and a number of partners, have hosted over the past 6 months. Today's conference is the third and final in that series, and ACS has been honored to be a part of these conversations and looks forward to continuing this work. I also want to thank Berkeley Law for being our co-host and providing this space for today's conference, as well as all of their support. In particular, I want to thank Jenny Boyden, Director of Berkeley Law Events, for all her assistance and support in helping to coordinate the logistics so that today will run smoothly. Thank you, Jenny. Though she is not here, I also want to acknowledge and thank Doris Zhang, ACS's Program Associate, for all her work helping to organize the logistics of the conference from ACS's end. Of course, a huge thanks to Willie Forbath and Joey Fishkin. Their book, The Anti-Oligarchy Constitution, arrived at a challenging, but perhaps also an auspicious time. We as a country can no longer delay facing head-on the conservative capture of the federal judiciary and the dangers it presents. In particular, we must challenge the US Supreme Court's current predisposition, which certainly has historical antecedents, to favor wealth and power over fairness and equity. Progressives, really all of us, must reclaim the Constitution as a document that protects the vulnerable over the powerful and envisions economic justice as a core feature of a functioning democracy. Like all of you, I'm very excited to hear from our impressive lineup of speakers that we're lucky to have. So I want to offer one more thank you to John Simon, the Lance Robbins Professor of Criminal Justice Law here at Berkeley Law, for all his work helping to put together today's great program. And now I will turn it over to John.
Thank you, Christopher. Am I all right speaking through this mic? Good, excellent. Thank you. Let me ditto the thank yous that Christopher just gave. Deeply indebted to the Hewlett Foundation, to Doris Zhang and the ACS team, to Jenny Boykin and the events group here. I'm deeply grateful for Willie and Joey bringing this book to us and this discussion. When they first mentioned it, it struck me as an important conversation to bring to California. California has been kind of a leading edge of changes in our political economy and in constitutional politics, from Upton Sinclair's End Poverty in California in the 30s, which prefigured in many ways the New Deal, through Ronald Reagan's taxpayer revolt in the 1980s, to mass incarceration in the 1990s and beyond. Right now, at this moment, we are in the midst of a kind of constitutional moment here in California, with a reparations commission, with major changes in our criminal legal imagination. So I think this is a conversation that is very timely, and I'm grateful for it being brought here. This is also a moment where sort of political economy as a topic is reemerging, and we're very pleased that Berkeley is a center of that, and grateful to the Hewlett Foundation for its support of political economy initiatives here. We are also very proud here at Berkeley Law to be hosting the Journal of Law and Political Economy, which is a peer-reviewed journal that encourages scholarship in this space, and we have its editors-in-chief here, so both Angela Harris and Jay Varela, so please buttonhole them if you want to pitch an article to them. So I don't want to take much more time now because I'll have a chance to talk about my interests in mass incarceration, the third reconstruction later today. But it's my real pleasure right now to invite and introduce Larry Kramer to share a few thoughts on our discussion today. Larry, in his work as head of the Hewlett Foundation, has really been a major force in building really this return to political economy in this country, and also in particular in the discussion around law and constitutionalism. In his own past life as a constitutional scholar, he wrote an incredibly important book that is now seems incredibly more prescient, The People Themselves, Popular Constitutionalism and GQ, which 20 years ago almost really began this discussion of what would it mean to imagine constitutionalism not in the hands of the 9 justices, at a time when many of, I would point to myself, liberals felt pretty complacent with an Anthony Kennedy Supreme Court that seemed okay, not now. In his even additional past life, Larry was also the dean of a law school, a well-regarded law school south and east of us, and has been a tremendous force in our community ever since. So Larry, let me invite you up to share some thoughts.
So thank you all. It's actually really great to be here, and I was actually really excited to be asked. I don't get asked. I said to somebody, I don't get even now. I don't get asked to speak because of me, I mean, or because of what we do at the foundation. I will say, two little quick asides. So one is, did you ever see the Madagascar, the cartoon? There's a scene in it when there's the animals go natural, the lion's looking up. Of furries, and they beep, beep, they start turning into little stakes in his mind. So I feel that way sometimes. Like people look at me and beep, I turn into a little dollar sign, which is why it's actually really nice to feel like this invitation came not because of that, but because of actually work and thinking that I have been doing over many years. And actually, I thought of that mostly because where all that work started was during a year when I was visiting at Columbia with Willie and Reva Siegel, and and Robert was around, and the 3 of us spent that year talking and fighting about these issues that have spun out in all of our different work in different way. But Willie also was thinking about these same issues. So I just want to say a couple things to frame how we see this and see this as part of a larger set of issues. There's a lot of talk these days about neoliberalism, right? What it is, why it's bad or good, depending on who you are, what should replace it if you think it's bad. And almost all of that talk, at least when people focus on neoliberalism, thinks of it as an economic theory, probably because it's so associated with Milton Friedman and the Chicago School. And in some sense, people see it as the Chicago School itself is just neoclassical economics with a kind of ideological overlay that distorted, various aspects of it. And then all of the replacement ideas that are out there tend likewise to be economic arguments for different policies that will produce better economic outcomes for different people than we get under the current neoliberal approach to economic policy. And, the big difference being, say, let's replace market efficiency and liberty with values more focused around distributive fairness and equality. But it's still too constricted a view. Not only does it drain the debate of its full scope and meaning, but it loses the ambition, the ambitions of the reformers, and as a result, it actually reduces progress. By turning it into like a catfight over a particular policy, opposed to a much larger and more important debate and discussion about the future of the republic. And that's, of course, because neoliberalism itself is, in fact, much more than just an economic program. It always was much more than an economic program. And to replace it, you're going to need something equal in scope and ambition. So like others in talking about this, I've referred to neoliberalism as in paradigm. I get a lot of pushback on the use of paradigm and yada, yada, yada. But, I'm not terribly concerned with the the details of that so much as just trying to capture an idea, right? Because it's just a label for the notion of a comprehensive vision. So let me say a few words about what I mean, at least when we talk about the idea of an intellectual paradigm. So as I said, it's much more than an economic theory. It's really a comprehensive worldview, an ethical, economic, legal, and political framework about the goals of society and the respective roles of individuals, government, and civil society and markets in it. Think of Jefferson's agrarian republic, or Hamilton's commercial republic, or Jackson's market democracy, or FDR's New Deal, or for that matter, neoliberalism as put forward by Ronald Reagan. Each of those was built on a vision for the purpose of our republic that was connected to understandings about the roles of those constituent elements. Now, the other thing that I think we often lose sight of is those paradigms work differently for different actors within the system at large. So for policymakers or academics, the kind of people who are going to be here today, it is a comprehensive theory, a political theory, an economic theory that we use to generate solutions to particular problems. For ordinary citizens, though, it's less than that and more than that at the same time. It's more like a condensed story that reflects what, if it works, comes to be seen as their intuitions about how the world does and should work, and as such inspires them to action, whether it's action in voting or action in how they participate in their communities. And then sitting between those are politicians and journalists and public intellectuals whose task is to translate the solution offered by the policymakers and academics into terms that make sense for the citizenry. And the paradigm works when the solutions being generated work well enough in the real lives of people to reinforce the intuitions they have. So that doesn't mean consensus. There's never consensus. There's always going to be lots of disagreement. There's still a left and a right within a paradigm, right? There are progressive neoliberals galore out there. Barack Obama's a progressive neoliberal. Bill Clinton was a progressive neoliberal. Cass Sunstein is a progressive neoliberal. And then there are conservative neoliberals. So there's a left and a right, and there's lots of disagreements, but it's taking place within a broad. So as such, a paradigm isn't right or wrong. I mean, we want to argue about it as if it is, and it seems that way perhaps to the actors sitting in the middle of it, but it's really an explanation. It's an explanation that people use to make sense of a really complex world, right? An explanation of how that world does and should work. So the paradigm, in effect, is a thumb on the scale in favor of some things and against others. It can still be overcome. It's not determinative because there's a lot of other factors and vectors that shape actual outcomes in the world, but it's right, material interests are out there, the serendipity of who your advocates are, the timing of events, all those. So the intellectual framework operates as or the common sense intuitions operate as a thumb on the scale in favor of some things and against others. And the fact that they can be overcome is part of what makes it messy. But if the paradigm is working in general in the lives of people, it still continues to exercise a powerful gravitational pull. And it breaks down when it loses its explanatory power, when the solutions are no longer working for too many people, at which point progressively larger numbers of people begin to lose faith in the institutions that were built to operationalize the paradigm, and you get a period of political disruption like the one we're in the middle of now. Until that is, another paradigm achieves similarly broad acceptance. Now, there's no guarantee that the replacement paradigm is going to be good. Lots of people in the 1920s and 30s became communists. Lots of people became fascists. And lots of people today, as the neoliberal paradigm breaks down, are drifting towards various forms of ethno-nationalism, or think of it as just the 21st century version of fascism. And we see that all over the world, not just in the United States, although we also see it here. So the task in front of us is to come up with something better before that happens, and to do it pretty quickly. Now, I just want to then note a couple of final points about this idea that I think help frame today's conference. First is the fact that in the United States, these paradigms have always been attached to a vision of the Constitution, right? That is indeed, the real purpose and meaning of our Constitution, not just to kind of set out a neutral set of procedures to run a government. The Constitution was designed to create a Republican system that itself is designed to realize some kind of substantive vision of and for the purpose of that republic. Constitution in this country then has always been the site on and through which we fight about the meaning of our republic. So the earlier references to Jefferson's agrarian republic or Hamilton and FDR, to which you can add Jackson and Lincoln and Reagan, all of them offering constitutional visions that amounted to political, ethical, legal frameworks to understand and think about the world. And each of those, that's not like they developed those ideas themselves, but they stood at the head of a movement that offered that kind of vision of our republic. Okay, second, I think probably maybe one of, if not the most unfortunate development in the last half of the 20th century was the move from seeing the Constitution as the charter for a substantive vision of a good republic to seeing it as just a legal code, right? Important, but just ordinary law to be interpreted and controlled by courts. Now that move was led and fostered by the left, by liberals. Right, by liberals so enamored with the little blip in US history that was the Warren Court that they basically gave up the idea of a political vision of the Constitution and legal. That didn't happen on the right. Neoliberalism has offered exactly that kind of comprehensive vision of society. And we know the basis for it, right? It's based on a notion of individualism. It's based on defining freedom as simply government not being in your way. And following from that, a notion of individual then responsibility for whatever consequences lives. It's your fault. If you succeed, it's your efforts. If you fail, it's your fault. Empowering that through a vision of small government and originalism itself being a theory of interpretation that nicely attaches to that vision using an original understanding, not really well understood in its original way or context, but pulled out of context in a way that values that underlie that. And then all of that, of course, in fact, connected to an economic theory. Now, neoliberals lay their claim very much grounding it in an understanding of US history. One of the strands in US, again, I think largely distorted, particularly if you think about it in terms of where we were founding, but then those notions of individualism, of individual rights understood as protecting the individual from the government, and that's what it's about, negative rights. All of those ideas are drawn from and grounded in an understanding of US history. It's not completely made up whole cloth. It is in fact a strand of US history. There is, though, a competing tradition grounded in pre-revolutionary ideas of civic republicanism, modified and instantiated differently by the revolution itself. And it's that tradition, which is the subject of Joey's and Willie's book, and is the basis on which we might be able to begin to think about constructing a new paradigm for the 21st century, right? And that's the topic of today's conference. It's about, can we recapture a different strand in American history and use it to shape a better understanding that will give us a better world today, which is why I think this is such an important book and why we funded these conferences and the efforts to sort of push the idea out there. It's one of very few efforts to do. One of the most depressing things is how few efforts there are to do this. Even today, within all this work that we've been funding at the foundation, we have trouble getting people to think about the larger theory and getting them to think beyond just economics and just a set of policies and to link those to an overarching vision. And even then, it's not just doing it for people like us, for academics and for policymakers, but it's also figuring out how to push those ideas out into the larger public, which is why I said to Willie earlier today, they really need to do another version of the book that's about a third as long and accessible to ordinary people, and not even for ordinary people, but ultimately for politicians, for political leadership, because at the end of the day, that's where these things get moved. So let's understand, shape a vision, understand where it comes from, understand why it's important to begin to move that out in the world. And that this book is a really important first step in that direction. And so I look forward to learning more about it. Thank you.
Willie, I think it's time to talk about the book. So we're going to leave the podium raised for the moment. Mic on something, or can we switch to the
mic that's
up there?
Yeah. Oh, good. This is on? Yeah, sounds like it. So thank you to Jen, to Chris, to John Simon, and to Larry for all your respective roles in pulling this together, and thank you all for taking part. This is extremely exciting. So what I have to say will sort of flow pretty seamlessly from what Larry has said. Right? The question that the first panel, which I'm looking forward to, is going to talk about is whether rekindling constitutional arguments and constitutional politics around political economy is a good idea for the broad left. And one of the things that our book suggests is for most of US history, that question couldn't have arisen because political economy simply was the stop of constitutional law and constitutional politics. We know this in a partial way about slavery. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces clashed over the Constitution. But even in respect of slavery, we don't fully understand how much our battles for most of US history about social and economic life were, in the words of Dirk Hartog long ago, battles about what it was the nation abolished when it abolished slavery. And the sort of clashes over slavery, right, reverberated through many other conflicts over how we organize political and economic life in ways I'll suggest and in ways that will emerge as we talk later today. But the short of it is that things that now are seen as simply matters of economic policy, right, were also the most pressing constitutional issues of the day for most of the US past. Things like the uses and parceling out of homesteads, the public lands in the West, the tariff, free trade versus protectionism, banking and currency, gold versus silver versus greenbacks, right? Antitrust and corporations, as well as labor and employment law were all, right? All sides in these battles were making constitutional arguments about how we organize and govern economic life, right? They made them in court, but as Larry suggested, most of all, they made them in ordinary politics. They made them in election campaigns, in the halls of Congress. No one doubted the Constitution spoke to economic arrangements. The question was what it said. These were arguments about constitutional polity, and conservatives never stopped making them. But as Larry said, liberals and progressives did stop. They stopped because they came to believe in the scientific and technocratic promise of the new discipline of economics, and they lost hold of the insight that these so-called economic questions were at bottom political questions about how we distribute wealth, power, and opportunity. They forgot or abandoned their own traditions of political economy. And in the mid-20th century, those who refused to forget or abandon those traditions, socialists, communists, and even social democrats, were shoved out of the mainstream by the brutal purges that accompanied the Cold War. At the same time, as mainstream liberals forgot their traditions of political economy, they also forgot or abandoned their own traditions of constitutional arguments about the way we organize economic life. And again, conservatives never forgot. They're sort of like the, horse and the elephant. And they famously held on to Lochnerism, constitutional property rights, liberty of contract. They held on to their own master principle that the Constitution condemns redistribution. And they called this the Constitution in exile. Right? True, the mid-20th century court had no truck with these ideas, although they remained in the sort of subterranean structures of constitutional law even then, but basically the court pushed back. But that was no impediment for conservatives because conservatives had no truck with much of what the court called constitutional law. Conservatives kept right on making constitutional arguments in the polity, And Brown v. Board in this sense, right, was the fuel. Brown v. Board and the Warren Court and Berger Court, the blip that Larry referred to, right, and other landmark civil liberties and civil rights decisions, right, did two things. Right? They beckoned liberals and progressives to fall in love with the court, and they gave conservatives, generations of them, the fuel to assail the court and its constitutional law as counterfeit and usurpation. Right? And these same decisions inspired liberals and progressives to become defenders of judicial supremacy. Reformers had always, for centuries, seen the courts as hostile territory, occasionally theaters for pushing their causes, but no place to look for, right, the main push for any kind of progressive transformation. Reformers were the ones who called the court's constitution. But now in the mid-20th century, for the first time in US history, liberals and progressives bought into the idea that the court was the final arbiter of the Constitution. And even now, right, most liberals and progressives have a very hard time with the idea of returning to our forebears' insistence that Larry did so much to sort of put into the conversation, that the political branches and the people themselves, and not the courts, should have the last word on what our constitutional principles mean. And that is poignant, especially when it comes to political economy. The conservative tradition, anti-redistributive, anti-regulatory, anti-labor, pro-freedom of so-called private enterprise, is one that courts can take up, right? As the Roberts-Alito Court amply has shown. It often just requires striking things down. But the progressive tradition, what Joey and I call the democracy of opportunity tradition, or the anti-oligarchy tradition, is one that requires much legislative work. Courts can't enact social insurance or universal job guarantees. It takes legislation. It takes political work. This tradition that we've chronicled, right, changed over time dramatically. But as we could reconstruct it, it has three basic principles. First, it holds the Constitution requires us to prevent the concentration of too much wealth and power in the hands of too few people. Second, it requires a broad, dispersal of wealth and power among all the people. And third, it declares that all the people really means all the people. Right? A principle of inclusion is the third principle, right? Across lines of race, sex, and other divisions of social, right, difference and subordination. The three principles are mutually interdependent. You can't sustain the first two without the third, as the rise and fall of Reconstruction and the unraveling of the New Deal order over Jim Crow demonstrate. And the court's role in implementing this tradition of constitutional political economy is often simply to stay out of the way and give the political branches work a fair interpretation. And that may require taking seriously the idea and being surrounded by a public discourse that takes seriously the idea that there are constitutional, right, purposes and principles driving the measures the court's being asked to strike down. That, right, in this legal and political culture, right, has weight. This insight that there are constitutional purposes and principles in the state building and legislative work of political economy in the hands of lawmakers came naturally in a world in which lawmakers understood that they were doing constitutional work as well as policy, right? That constituting our political economy with statutes and state building was constitutional work. So now the Roberts Court is acting like a new Lockwood Court, eviscerating measures like Medicaid expansion and campaign finance laws. Student debt forgiveness is in the court's crosshairs. And today's court is surely likely to embrace right-wing challenges to a wealth tax or to any new ambitious labor laws like the one that Congress passed in 2020, that the House passed in 2021. The difference is, right, a century ago, right, when conservatives said the Constitution condemns these kind of big redistributive measures, progressives and liberals said, no, it doesn't only permit, it requires such measures. Not so today. Today, when courts or conservatives say these kinds of measures, the prospect of a wealth tax, of an ambitious labor law reform, violates the Constitution, liberals simply say, no, it doesn't. The Constitution is silent. The Constitution doesn't speak, right, to economic life and how we organize it. Right? We don't think that's sufficient. Right? We think a better outlook in one, because it's right, because you can't be indifferent to the kind of political economy you have if you want to sustain a democratic republic, and because it's grounded, not in not in the sort of only plausible account of our constitutional past, but rather, as Larry says, in one strand of it, which we embrace not because it has a rich history, but because it's right. But this outlook means Congress and others have a duty to enact and implement these measures. One critical turning point in this story, and here I'm wrapping up, and we're only a little bit over. We're okay. Anyway, a high watermark of this story that for our purposes is Reconstruction. We think it's important to recover the view of Reconstruction that Congress had a constitutional duty in the minds of the framers of those amendments, right, to enact laws that protected, of course, the ex-slave civil and political rights, but also a duty to provide land and education, to break up the old slaveholding oligarchy and provide a social base for the ex-slaves standing as citizens. The idea wasn't simply, as conservatives today imagine, a colorblind principle of non-discrimination on race. It was an upending of the whole Southern plantation oligarchy system, and that was the language they used. That was one of the riveting things about doing this primary research, is how much the word oligarchy isn't just sort of a coinage out of Fishkin and Horvath's fevered imaginations, but really the language of constitutional politics throughout sort of the 18th, 19th, and even early 20th century. Brandeis famously, conjured with the phrase all the time. And the tradition, again, in the Reconstruction Republicans' views, and not only the radical Republicans. The radicals were more gung-ho about massive redistribution, but even the moderates said, we have to take the abandoned plantations. We have to put land under the feet of the ex-slaves. FDR and the New Dealers cast their reforms as matters of constitutional obligation, right? When the stakes were high, Americans had come to expect their parties and their representatives to flout the court. When the stakes were high, that was Jefferson and Madison and later Jackson. Not only did they have a constitutional political economy, they had a tradition of saying the court has its say, but so do we. And at the end of the day, the people will decide. We learned this first from Larry, and what Joey and I have brought to the table is partly this focus that it was about political economy. There are many tools to push back against a right-wing court, but we think none of them, right, will win the hearts and minds of American people without an account that says it's more than just tit for tat. It's more than just we want to enact our policies. We want an account that says the court has the Constitution dead wrong. The court has the Constitution backwards. The kinds of rights and laws that it's striking down aren't simply ones the Constitution permits. If you want to keep your constitutional democracy, the Constitution requires, in the sense of depends on, such a political economy, right? So, New Dealers would often argue, and this echoes where Larry ended, right? That if you want to safeguard constitutional democracy, if you want to stem a slide into some homegrown version of American fascism, you had better enact a social democratic constitutional political economy. Their efforts foundered on race. They went some way to challenging Jim Crow and the South's feudal social and economic system and political order, but they failed. the solid South, and white supremacy combined with the power of capital to halt them. They still may have stemmed the rise of some virulent homegrown form of American fascism in the 30s and 40s, but we may not be so lucky. The third Reconstruction had better succeed. Thank you.